And a warm welcome to everybody from the southwest of France. All over the world, we seem to be on these calls. It's Wednesday evening, so it must be the time for the network webinar. Sorry, I just had something strange coming up on my screen. So it's a great pleasure to welcome Bob Hesse as our speaker this evening. We met in the Science of Consciousness Conference in Interlaken in July of 2019, where he was giving a presentation and we were presenting the Galileo Commission on a poster. And we got talking after his talk, because obviously, as you can see from this evening, and what he's going to be talking about is very much in the central interest of consciousness, near-death experiences, mystical experiences, which are the essential focuses of the network. And so, as you may have seen from the biography, Bob is a permanent Catholic deacon who's president of the Contemplative Network, and you can see that on his slide. And he's dedicated to interdenominational Christian contemplative prayer, teaching, scientific research, and interfaith dialogue. And he was inspired by Thomas Merton, who I've also been very inspired by, and also Thomas Keating, who died not that long ago. And unfortunately, we never managed to get Thomas Keating to Mystics and Scientists. So that's regrettable. And he's also connected with the Texas Medical Center with his interest in spirituality and health, and with degrees in faith and in science. And so he's very much comes from an interdisciplinary perspective, and it's a great pleasure for us to have him this evening on neural and anatomical correlates, comparing memories of NDE and mystical experiences. Over to you, Bob.
David, thank you very much, and thank you for everyone joining, and I hope to make this interesting and at everybody's level, not that I'm going to be below. I'd like to start with the fact that the main neuroscientist behind this is Calixto Machado, and we're going to have this presentation in 4 sections. I'll give a break slide between each section so you know when I'm switching from background to objective, to research, and to conclusions. First, I'll give some background and how this research happened to come about, but I first have to go through some terminology. Obviously, everyone here knows what NDE is, but we coined the term spiritual contemplative experience because I felt there was a need for that kind of a term to describe mystical experiences that were not connected with near death. And so I'm saying it's synonymous with mystical experiences and not the same as out of body. Out of body is common quite often to both. And how I got started in this is I started to attend and give presentations at various conferences. And I want to go through this because it relates to why we did the research. There are 2 basic. There's philosophical, non-theistic, and religious theistic conferences. The first was an invitation that the Dalai Lama made to Father Thomas Keating, my mentor, and Keating asked me to go be an advanced mat at the Minded Life Institute conference. And clearly, they have done a lot of research on Richie Davidson, et cetera, have done research on meditation. Everybody knows about that, but the Buddhists have done a lot of that way in advance of anybody else. Then I attended a conference in Cuba on the brain, death, and disorders of consciousness, which is kind of related, but more related to bringing people out of coma and the medical side of it. And I met an individual there, in fact, Calixto Machado. I'll talk about that later. Then I was involved and gave presentations at the Conference on Medicine and Religion, which is Harvard University of Chicago Institute for Spirituality and Health, which I was vice chairman of, and I'm still in the faculty of. And then the European Conference on Religion, Spirituality, and Health, which is basically the European version of the CMR. But what was interesting about these conferences is there was essentially no cross-fertilization between the conferences. Now, that was not necessarily true of the 2 religious conferences, but I was a bit stunned about that, and I kind of knew it because I was only running into myself. I didn't see many other people I recognized. Now, that last one, the religious one, really draws on research, medical research, and I would say the most important book on that subject has been the Handbook of Religion and Health, edited by Harold Koenig. And this is really a synopsis of all the research of various farms, okay? And it takes, the research in that area takes in three sections. It's basically, if you have a faith belief, a theistic faith belief, there's been a lot of medical research done on that. Not much on spirituality, because spirituality can't be quantified. So the research was done basically on interviewing people on their faith belief. And this particular research that is in the box showed an increase of well-being if you had a faith belief. Church attendance regularly led to a longer lifespan of as much as 7 years. And prayer practice and the effect on the brain of prayer. This particular research project to the right was one I was involved with the Baylor College of Medicine in Houston, and showed a link between less and depression. So this led me to want to look more at the prayer types and how much research had been done other than just the Buddhists and the Tibetan Buddhists, which they've done a lot. So, all faiths share two types of prayer: discursive, which is cataphatic in Greek, which is really guided meditation, and the other is contemplative, apophatic. And centering prayer is a prayer practice that I learned with Keating, Father Keating, who was my mentor. And because of that, I learned to teach it. And that quite often will open the vestibule to an experience of contemplative prayer or mystical prayer, or even a spiritual contemplative experience. What's interesting about the nomenclature is that meditation is really means, the etymology of the word means to engage the imagination. Contemplation is really focused prayer, like on a mantra. But the term meditation has been kind of bastardized to mean both of these, one and two, but it's really not in the historical sense. Now, when I teach centering prayer, I wanted to tell you kind of very quickly how I do it so it relates to the research. We choose a sacred word or image as our intention to be with God. We sit in a comfortable position for 20 minutes with our eyes closed, no interruptions. And then every time, and this is the key part, every time we become aware of our thoughts or become aware we're engaging with our thoughts, we ever so gently return to our sacred word. Now that could be an image, a word, it could be our breath, but the important key difference in the theistic approach is that it is a symbol of your desire to be with God. Basically, you're desiring to be with God even more than being with your own thoughts. And then there's a gentle readjustment and return after 20 minutes. We don't get up and do a jig, okay? So then the idea was, how did this research come about? Well, when I was teaching centering prayer, I would run it. I've taught it maybe thousands, and I've seen the unconscious unloading to the conscious brain. The iceberg floating in the ocean is kind of a symbol of how much of our brain is unconscious and how much is conscious. The conscious is above the water, 95% is below. And in the centering prayer practice, I've seen this unloading process take place. After it's over with, we talk about it, the participants. And I was teaching 10 people in Houston. And at the end of this 20-minute sit, which was their first ever, 3 of them started to retell how they had just relived an earlier near-death experience. I must tell you, I was stunned. I was a fly on the wall listening, and they relived it to the same full extent that they lived it when they had a near-death experience. And I took a mental note of this and carried it with me. Then I was invited to give presentation at the Disorders of Consciousness Conference in Cuba, which is actually a very international conference. And I met Calixto Machado, who's one of the world's experts in bringing people out of coma. And we talked about, and it basically was an opportunity. I put together a team to take down there. And it was the first time that religion had been presented to a university setting down there since the revolution. Then I was asked by Calixto if I would do a breakout session and teach century prayer. And I said, well, I don't know, is that appropriate here? It's an atheistic country. I mean, what do you want me to do? And he said, just go ahead and do it. So I did, and his daughter gathered all of her neuroscience friends together, and they attended. And at the end of a 20-minute set, she started to proceed to tell about her profound near-death experience, profound mystical experience that she had during that prayer practice. I've seen this happen about 5% of the time at varying degrees. What made me connect the two experiences, number 2 experience and number 4, it dawned on me that Dr. Machado has access to a lot of people who have been brought back out of coma. I asked him, have you had many talk about near-death experiences? And he said, oh, all the time. Well, as it turns out, the conference was in English, but I invited a friend of mine, Father Walker, who's an American and probably one of the few Americans that's lived in Cuba for any length of time. And he used to be the chairman of Contemplative Outreach, which was founded by Keating and 2 other Trappist monks. Well, he lives in Havana. And I didn't want to risk language translations, because I don't speak Spanish, when teaching the prayer. So he came in and taught the prayer. And that's when Calixto's daughter had the experience. She went back and told her father about the experience. And then I realized that Father Walker would have access to those who have had mystical experiences, because normally people won't talk about them when they've had them, but they would talk to somebody who's taught them the practice. I called him, and sure enough, he said, oh, I've got a number of people that have told me about it. Suddenly, the synchronistic availability of these 2 databases, or I shouldn't say databases, subjects, came to the fore. So thus was the research born. The objective was then to think about this as transcendent consciousness. And I made a mental note when I look back at this that NDE and SCE both had 4 attributes that were measured by the Grayson scale that were common. One is paranormal, out of body for NDE, and SCE is there's an ecstasy, a spaceless feeling. Cognitive timelessness in NDE, and a sense of the prayer lasting very short time when it was actually a very long time, an effective sense of peace, and a wholeness, a sense of perfection, and a transcendent divine spiritual sense in NDE, and the same is true of SCE. A sense of oneness to the universe. And this symbol is indicative of all the religions experiencing a sense of oneness in their practice. So what were the motivations for the research? Well, that previous slide, I showed all the religions having this sense of oneness when they practice their form of contemplative prayer. 87% of religious believe in 87% of the population believes in a transcendent life and a transcendence into a next life. So this would be important to 87% of the population. Interfaiths have described SCE and NDE for centuries. Conferences need cross-fertilization for benefits, and I saw that. Medicine debates the bioethics of defining death. People have reported reliving NDE and SCE, and I saw that myself, which stunned me. And neuroscientists seek consciousness neurocorrelates. And science recognizes similar NDE and SCE attributes. So what was the objective? The goal was to compare neural and anatomical correlates of remembering NDE and SCE. Uniqueness, first-time direct neural comparison has been made between the 2. Now, there may have been, but I didn't find it. And in the way we've approached this, and somebody out there, you can tell me if I'm all wet, but I think this is kind of unique. So the results are hopefully will shed light on the motivations for the study. So that was our objective. We had a number of committed researchers, including Harold Koenig, the editor of that magazine, Andrew Newberg, who's done brain scans of Catholic nuns that were practicing centered prayer. Ramiro Salas, the researcher at Baylor College of Medicine, but the main neuroscientist was Calixto Machado. And his daughter, Janine Machado, is also a neuroscientist. Now I'm going to switch to the research. What was the protocol? Well, we had study subjects, 5 NDE and 5 SE, confirmed by the Grayson scale. Did neurological exam, CAT scan, and MRI to eliminate subjects with brain damage. We went to a resting state to establish a baseline for evaluation. We did a guided meditation to standardize, it was in a standardized approach to facilitate the remembering process. So once we got to that remembering process, and the guided meditation went into silence and let the person remember. And what was interesting is that the memory tests, both number 4 and number 5, we were talking about remembering. What I was not convinced about until Calixto Machado convinced me, because I'm not a neuroscientist, was, well, Calixto, you're not capturing this people when they actually had it. I mean, it's impossible to catch them. How are we going to do that? He says, all you got to do is get them to remember it. It's the basis of PTSD. It's the basis of a lot of problems neurologically. And he said, it's pretty well accepted that the remembering process can capture to a great extent. So when they were actually in the memory state, the memory tests, we did neural scans and anatomical assessments for both NDE and SCE, okay? The research subjects, this is a background on who they, basically their background. I'm not going to go into the detail other than to point out that there were 5 of each, and that they were, and the Grayson scale was applied. And obviously the NDE had more issues because they went through a dying process. Research phases. Now, when we started this research, we wanted a snapshot neural evaluation. We chose the tool of QEEGT. Now, I'm going to explain how we got to that tool. But the first research was done for this, and we didn't think past our belly button, basically. This was the first research. It was reported in Switzerland. And then only later did we decide, well, we need to go to a second phase. We need continuous neural, and we chose continuous EEG. And then we needed continuous anatomical, which we abbreviated continuous AA. So this presentation is going to cover all 3 of these. The chosen tool, we wanted a tool for the first phase, had good spatial ability and temporal ability. In other words, a tool to be able to find out where in the brain it was happening and the speed at which it was happening. Well, you want something that's going to combine the best of both of those X and Y axes. This doesn't cut it. That doesn't quite cut it. This is kind of low definition. We chose QEEG, which is quantitative electroencephalogram tomography. And there's a method for applying that, Loretta method, which is best used for pathophysiological brain mechanisms involved in NDE and SE, because it combines EEG timing with MRI spatial. Basically, it's combining this with that. Now, this was chosen by Calixto, and he's very familiar with this in people coming back from dying. In fact, he discovered a new state of consciousness that he reported here in Houston in his process of trying to bring people back from unconscious states. Now I'm not going to go through all these in super detail, but I will tell you we did the QEEGT in different frequencies. This is the alpha frequency, and this is a 3D reconstruction, if you will, of the scans, so we don't go through data lines. And it showed an increased inactivation for both NDE and SC that was similar, but it was greater for SCE. We did it in the gamma range frequency. And all NDE and SCE subjects he showed parietal occipital activation extending to the temporal regions, but it was greater in SCE. So you can tell the color is more intense in the SCE compared to the NDE, but compared to the baseline, they were both the same, but that's where we moved to. So there was definitely a similarity between NDE and SCE, but more seriously engaged in the NCE. Delta frequency, we didn't compare delta to the baseline, we just compared it to the two, and there was an increased activation for both NDE and SCE in both the right and left temporal lobes, while greater in right hemisphere, yet overall greater for the SCE. Now I'm going through the data. I haven't, we're not going to draw conclusions right away. We did it for the frontal lobes, increased activation for NDE, SCE in frontal lobes. It was greater for SCE. Same phenomenon's happening. Now we went to the continuous neural, CEEG. First, we did separate hemispheres, and this is a grand average for all subjects for separate hemispheres. SCE showed a greater activation compared with NDE. So you can see the lines here are much higher than for NDE, but the duration period, which is starting from here to here, is the same. I mean, there's definitely a correlation. Combined hemispheres, grand average of all subjects for both hemispheres shows increments of amplitude correlation between NDE and SCE remembering time, but increased again was greater with SCE. So it's still showing more intensity for SCE. Frontal leads, the CEG grand average for all subjects in both hemispheres. SCE had greater activation compared to with NDE. Now the activation intensity is the number of lines, not their amplitude. So there's definitely correlation taking place. Alpha and gamma, CEG frontal lobes grand average for all subjects in both hemispheres. SCE had greater activation compared to NDE. Again, same thing. And over the same duration. You can see there is nothing happening here until they remember, and then the remembering stops. So there's a correlation in the middle. Now we went to continuous anatomic assessment. What we assessed was heart rate and heart rate variability. Now the heart rate variability is variation in time interval between consecutive heartbeats. And the methods that were used were standard deviation of normal to normal intervals of heart rate, root square of successive differences. So that's what it was plotted, basically. Now, here's where it gets interesting. And there's a curve in this whole research that I didn't expect. And it's understandable, but I didn't expect it. SCE peaceful. Everybody reported, all the SCE patients reported and subjects reported a peaceful experience in their remembering process. And there was a significant decrease in heart rate and increase in heart rate variability measured by SDN and RMS-SD. All subjects reported a sense of peace. So this is consistent. The heart rate goes up and the difference in the heartbeats, according to Calixto, is very typical of a peaceful state. NDE peaceful. There were only 2 NDE subjects that reported peaceful NDE, and I abbreviated that with a P NDE just so I could keep my head straight here. With significant decrease in heart rate and increase in heart rate variability. And this correlated very well with the SCE peaceful experience that people had. Now there's the NDE anxious heart rate. 3 of the 5 NDE subjects reported anxious NDE, and I say A NDE, with an increase in heart rate and decrease in heart rate variability. Their heart is pumping away. They're anxious. They're nervous in the remembering process. So we've been through the 3 phases of the research. And what are the conclusions? Well, the primary conclusions, and these are preliminary conclusions, okay? Because and I'll get into it why. There was a significant QEEGT and CEEG neurocorrelation across broad frequency ranges and Grayson scales between NDE and SCE. High correlation. Higher neural for SCE consistent with the fact the subject was not dying. So we attributed the higher ratings on the SCE to the fact that the patient was going through a pleasant experience all the way through. There was no dying process. the significant emotional correlation between SCE and PDE was significant. The normal SCE and the pleasurable NDE was significant. There was no correlation between the anxious NDE and the SCE. This is consistent with the memory of more painful cause of dying. It's basically a struggle of what memory are they remembering exactly in NDE. And here's what was confusing. When we applied the Grayson scale at phase 1, we got correlation. Then when we saw this difference with the pleasant and an unpleasant NDE, we went back to the subjects, and they started to recognize that during that remembering period, even though they gave us different QEEG results and different CEEG results, the Grayson scale, one of them started to want to change it. And what was happening, we believe, is they had conflicting memories between painful dying and pain-free out of body. And this is actually reported in the literature that when you interview people that they've had a bad NDE experience, quite often, because they were at a pleasurable place, and from what I've read, it's very often a pleasurable place, and then when they're being asked to come back, they don't want to, and that makes them anxious because they went through a painful process to get there. So what were the limitations on this research? And these are the limitations. Even though Calixto convinced me otherwise, he admits and I admit that there's never a certainty that the event is the same as a remembering. The other criticism that's been leveled at this research is that the control state was remembering just a resting state. It wasn't remembering anything like peeling a banana, okay? And that's been a criticism. And the other is the obvious, and that's there aren't many subjects. That's why all of this research is preliminary. Well, what are some of the highlights of each of these phases? Well, this is the quantitative EEG measured across a broad spectrum of wavelengths. What do these different wavelengths imply in neuroscience? Gamma implies increased cognitive activity. So there was a correlation between the two states, NDE and SCE, in a cognitive activity, alpha, greater concentration, delta indicative of an inhibited sensory perception of the body in favor of internally directed cognition, internal mentation. In other words, basically, in this wavelength, it's indicative of out-of-body experience, if you will. That would be not a surprise. And then the frontal lobe activations implied greater attentiveness and cognitive function. Now, I have to tell you, I've dealt with a lot of people who've died, and were dying, and quite often they will come and become much more cognitive toward the end. It's a strange thing to observe, and I've observed it in my dealings. And this kind of implies that. The CEEG measured amplitude increases in activation intensity, increases similar between NDE and SCE. The increases are greater in gamma, cognition, and alpha concentration. In other words, those wavelengths that are tied to cognition and concentration. Increases greater for SCE, which is not quite of a surprise. Greater activation for SCE with frontal lobes of both hemispheres, indicating greater attentiveness and an increment of cognitive function. So I hope you're getting a flavor for what we were running into here. The autonomic assessment measured by SDN and RMSD were the heart rates and heart rate variability. NDE subjects feeling peace had a significant decrement of heart rate and increment of heart rate variability. Well, those were only 2 subjects. All SCE subjects felt peace and had significant decrement of heart rate and increment of heart rate variability. NDE subjects feeling anxious had a significant increment of heart rate and decrement of heart rate variability. So that's what I said before. It's just kind of getting the highlights one more time. Now, I don't like to just stop at that. I like to kind of visualize out in the future. Where are we headed? What's going on here? Why are we interested in these transcendent states? Because I'm one of the 87% of the population, okay? And what are these transcendent events that we're talking about? Well, NDE, Moody described this first, as you know, in 1975, and Bruce Grayson's scale added to it. SCE was described by William James even earlier in the Varieties of Religious Experience. Those are transcendent events, in my view. That's where we're transcending between this world and the next. Is there another transcendent event? Singularity of the Big Bang is another transcendent event. Einstein's theories led to singularity attributes of the Big Bang. This is what I think is extremely fascinating. The attributes are similar for all three, and they shouldn't be a surprise, because if they're really transcendent events between this world and the next, they should be. Paranormal, out of body, spaceless, we covered those before. There is no dimension at the non-material singularity. Cognitive timelessness, timeless short prayer. Timeless, there's no light at the singularity. There's no time. Affective peace, wholeness, perfection. Everything's ordered at the singularity. It's zero entropy. There's a transcendent, divine, religious, transcendent feeling that NDE has given people. There's a oneness. Well, there are unified four forces. Now, Einstein only knew two at the time, but now four forces. Isn't this interesting that those three transcendent states, we didn't research the third because I don't know how you'd do it anyway, but I find that the fact that there are four attributes that are shared by all of these is fascinating. So this sense of oneness that people talk about with the universe when they're discussing these issues, I just kind of pictorially try to capture here, because there is something going on. And we don't know, scientists don't know, but there's something going on here, and we need to look deeper at it with the tools at least we have now and try to extend ourselves out. And so what's the path forward? Well, I think there's an encouragement here to expand the studies for more subjects. That's our feeling. Because we don't have enough subjects, and we can get our hands on more, but like you would expect, money is an issue, and getting financing for it is an issue. I was very fortunate because in Cuba, things were less expensive, and I was able to do this with private financing to get the financing to do the research. QEEGT, best for temporal and spatial. I said special, it should be spatial, sorry. Resolution of complex states of consciousness. So this tool has proven itself valuable for bringing people back that are in unconscious states, but it's a valuable tool for looking at NDE and mystical experiences. I think that the application of this research, the first thing that comes to my mind as a religious deacon is palliative care and ministry, to explore the use of century prayer to lessen the fear of dying and negative near-death experiences. I think if people were taught this practice, and I've seen it happen quite often, that they experience a sense of peace, if they were told and explained to them how the process of dying can lead to the same attributes, it would relieve a lot of their angst about dying. And I think this is a practical side of this that should be explored, and that should be, it could be the incentive for further research investment. We're interested in collaborative research, interdisciplinary cooperation for future studies, because obviously this is interdisciplinary. It's not one field completely. So I hope I didn't rush through this too fast, but I wanted to do my hour, so I did.
Bob, thank you very much indeed. Perhaps you could stop sharing your screen.
Yeah.
Now you've done very well indeed, in fact, because we're definitely ahead of time, we could, Andrew, what do you think? We could possibly go into, I don't want to start questions until we've had the break, but we could in fact go into breakout rooms just for maybe 10 minutes and then have a break.
Yes, we certainly can if you wish.
I think that would be a good. I think that would be a good thing. Then we can just exchange some impressions on that, which will then feed into the questions, and then we can start with John and Angus when we get to the second half.
Okay, good. So let me just set those up. So we'll have about, yeah, here we go. So I'll open those up now. So everyone, you should be seeing an invitation on your screen to go into a breakout room. So just click accept on that. And if you don't wish to go into a breakout room, that's absolutely fine. Just don't accept the invitation to go into it. And we'll come back out in about 10 minutes. Thank you.
Stop. And Andrew will put in the chat box the code for getting a discount if you'd like to join the Scientific Medical Network this evening. Now, Marilyn, you're quick off the block here. What's your question? You need to unmute yourself.
Not working. Yeah, now it has. Where's the speaker? Never mind. Thank you very much.
If he speaks, then you'll see him.
You'll come up again.
Yeah.
I've got a couple of comments and a couple of questions. My comments are, they were doing some animal experiments on what happens with fMRI in the brain when rats are dying. Horrible experiments, I have to say. But they found that the visual cortex lights up like crazy, and which seems to fit for me because of the experience of light. I don't know about the other senses. I talked to Peter about it, but mostly people talk about it light, not smell or taste or touch. The second thing, I've often wondered, like decades ago, people were talking about the God spot. And my scientific questions are, what does anybody think is the biological trigger and mechanism for that whooshing out into this alternative universe? And what might be the evolutionary significance, given that it has to be selected in evolution for some reason? Okay, that's all my comments and questions.
Bob.
A lot of, yeah.
I'm not sure I understand the question. Could you repeat the question part of that, please?
Well, I made a comment that the experiments with horrible experiments killing rats and doing fMRI with the rats as they die show huge activity in the visual cortex, which you didn't mention. Yeah. Secondly, I was wondering about decades ago, people used to talk about the God spot in the brain. But I think that's become obsolete or not. And finally, I'm, as a biologist, wondering what could be the biological trigger for bringing on whooshing out into an alternative parallel universe, into peace and light and et cetera, and what could be the evolutionary significance, supposing, as one might, that the NDE exists for a reason. It's selected in either by emergent happenings in the brain or whatever. So a lot of, I mean, maybe choose one thing because I've got 4 things there. Right.
Well, I don't think there's a God spot, but certainly the frontal lobes are the youngest, and they play a big role in making moral decisions. So we know that because of people whose brains have been damaged in the past. As far as the visual and what causes this departing, I don't know that science is necessarily going to ever be able to answer that, but I think we're dancing closer. And I think the fact that we are talking about these things is an indication that there is an evolutionary process taking place. I mean, I'm pretty much of a Teilhard de Chardin person who was ahead of his times. And so I think there is a spiritual dimension to this. And I think it's also technological. The fact we're doing Zoom here and we can share these things, we have a shared consciousness. So I really am a believer in the fact that there is an outside consciousness that is, and we can call that God, and we get little tastes of it once in a while. And the more we're opening ourselves up to listening, which is the listening process of prayer and meditation and contemplative prayer, the more likely we are to hear. Most people don't talk about these experiences, and I've come up with 5 reasons why they don't. Number one, the words are not able to describe the experience. Number 2, the memory of the experience leaves you. And so even trying to remember, and there was a comment on the chat, it's very, very true, that you lose the memory of it as you're getting further away from it. So it's not the same to try to remember it. Number 3, people think that you're a holy person. Well, that's got nothing to do with it as far as I'm concerned. Number 4, they try to get it. Well, they can't. And you don't get it. It's a gift that you open yourself up to. It's not something that you reach out and grab onto. In fact, that's the problem in the first place, is we want to grab onto stuff. Okay. And so I missed the 5th one, but anyway, there were 5. So anyway, and so I don't know if I answered your question. I don't know the answer to most of your thoughts.
Well, there's things to think about.
Yeah, thank you very much. Jeremy, you're next.
Thank you. I want to question the whole basis of your study, I'm afraid. I don't think that NDEs and SCEs are equivalent in the way that you're presenting them. If you go to your slide about transcendent consciousness, you're saying that NDEs, that you're making equivalent paranormal out of the body experience with spacelessness and sense of ecstasy in SCE. I don't think those are the same. In the second thing, you talk about cognitive timelessness in NDE, and then talking about timelessness in short prayer in SCE. In the SCE, I don't think those are equivalent either. Then you're talking in the NDE 3 effective peace, and then in the SCE 3 wholeness perfection. Those are different categories again. And 4, you've got transcendent divine spiritual something or other in the NDE, and the SCE some sort of sense of oneness and the universal. These are not the same things necessarily. And also, one of the things I find really I'm very uncomfortable about in the study of so-called SCEs is the tendency in the consciousness studies to lump together all sorts of different types of heightened experience which may happen in different traditions, and to lump also together those which happen in sort of spontaneously and those which may happen between people who are practicing in different traditions. And there's a real problem from the Christian apophatic tradition, which you're a devotee of Merton. I would have thought that the point is that in the apophatic spiritual tradition, experience is to be avoided. John of the Cross tells people, to turn away from experiences, and talks about them being a sign of the immaturity or the incapacity of the person who has them. And there's a real risk in spiritual growth and discipline, that you may go out and try and have more experiences. So I'm really very puzzled by this concentration on so-called spiritual contemplative experiences and how they fit into the different traditions. And I think, anyway, so that's my...
Thank you very much. That's a very, very comprehensive view. And I love your cat behind you.
Oh, yes. Sophia.
Her name is, she's Sophia.
Sophia, oh, very good. Wisdom. Excellent. Bob, what's your reaction to that generally? I mean, there's too many points to go into.
I think he shares the same concerns I share. And that is, if I gave the impression I was trying to say these are equivalent, there's equivalency, I didn't mean to. I see common attributes, but not equivalency necessarily. In terms of the different traditions, unfortunately, getting these subjects is difficult. I would have loved to have had them across traditions, but there's been enough research to show that this kind of phenomena is experienced in all traditions. It's not just to the Christian tradition. Okay.
Yeah, I have no problem with.
Yeah,
with
and then
experiences too. Yes.
Now, and then in terms of the spiritual side of this, you're absolutely right to try to seek this, and that's one of the reasons why people don't talk about it. You don't want to seek it. That's the whole point. So John of the Cross and Teresa of Avila were right, absolutely right. If you have this kind of experience, it's an encouragement. It's not a sign of finality, and so it's actually usually beginners that have these experiences.
Right.
Not the people who've been doing it for a long time. And so I think it's mainly an encouragement in a spiritual sense. But the very concept that you are letting go of your thoughts and letting go of control is what enables the divine healer to come in. It doesn't mean that, oh, once you get this wonderful experience, you try to hold on to it, because that's counter to the whole process. So you're absolutely right. I agree with you on the spiritual side too.
Well, that's a very satisfactory exchange. Thank you very much.
I'm a scientist, so I wanted to study it, okay? So,
Yeah, fair enough.
We're going on to Vasily next from Brussels. Vasily.
Hi, and thanks for the great lecture. One point that really excited me and made me very attentive, more attentive than the other part of the lecture is the role that you attribute in singularities in physics and the light. The light, that's my professional bias since I am a physicist, but and coming from an Orthodox tradition, although I'm not at all Christian, I mean, not at all good Christian, there is always in spiritual texts the distinction between the structured and unstructured light, the spiritual versus the real light. Now, and the descriptions of the unstructured light in Philokalia and St. Basil, it is described exactly like as if you read special relativity. I mean, once you become a being of light, or beings of light travel instantaneously in the universe, they read the mind of everything, which presupposes an inner structure, a noetic aspects of light, which physics does not have. So your proposal is courageous and path-breaking, and I wish you could elaborate and work on that further.
I should also say, Vasily, that you and Pier Francesco have been working on this aspect of light in the NDE and light in physics. So maybe you and Bob could correspond. I can put you in touch.
I'd love to. Yes.
Bob, what's your response to that?
Well, I think it's interesting. Some people will say to me, well, what's outside the universe? And in a sense, that's a nonsensical question, because we're trapped by the dimensions of space and time. If we went one direction, we'd come back the other, we would experience no edge. Just like they thought that the edge of the earth was you're gonna fall off of it. Well, then you walk around, you never find an edge. So we're trapped in those dimensions of space and time. And I read something about the logic that the famous scientist in the wheelchair at Cambridge, Hawking, gave in his explanation for God doesn't exist. And I read his work and I thought, this is interesting. Let's see, what was his logic? And he said, well, at the singularity, there was no space and time, so God had no time to create the universe. Well, my attitude to that is it's like saying to the guy who made the first Volkswagen, did he force himself to have to live inside of it? I mean, really? I mean, so the point is that we cannot get our hands around something that we can't experience. It's like asking a fish, what's it like to not have water? And the fish, if he could speak, would go, I have no idea what you're talking about. So that's the struggle, is that singularity is at that point where it transitions to no space, no time. That's the way I look at it.
Yeah, thank you very much. Bernard may have something to say on that, but actually it's John, you're next. I'm taking everybody in strict order. John Capp. You need to unmute, John.
Does that work? Can you hear me?
Yep, where you're on.
Thank you very much, Bob. I resonated with something you said near the beginning, that the unconscious unloads, I think was your word, into the conscious brain. And as I understand Ian McGilchrist, the left brain is the conscious side and the right brain is unconscious. I've got a sort of diagram. I don't know whether you can read it from where you are. I've made one. This is Freud's iceberg.
A little bit, not much.
And of course, the consciousness is on top of it. And I've turned it to 90 degrees to suggest, I hope this is on the, in other words, the left side is the conscious side and the right side is the unconscious. Would you agree that that is, and that it basically is we download consciousness waves into particles in our right brains, which are then processed, go through the corpus callosum, which is the division between the right and left, and then becomes conscious in the left brain. Any comments?
Well, I've never read anything about neuroscientific sense that the left brain is the unconscious. I've never seen that. It's what I've seen is that they don't know where the neuroscientists don't know where the conscious and the unconscious are. Okay, they're all melded together, but apparently the unconscious takes up more geography than the conscious, and it's not left brain, right brain. Now there's a lot of duality in the brain. I mean, there is a left brain, right brain duality. That if you sever the connection, you get some odd things happen. But there's also the duality, which I think is the most important duality in the brain, and that's the conscious and the unconscious. And so I think that prayer, and I say prayer, meditation, if you are a different tradition, and that what it does is it unloads the conscious meanderings of the monkey mind and leaves more room for unloading of the unconscious. And I think that's where quite often this higher consciousness level communicates with us. There are parts of the brain that are known now to get signals on a base 2 system, like a computer. And so what's to say that we're not getting a wormhole effect from past to future with information going to that part of the brain on a base 2 system and communicating. And so that explains perhaps why somebody might feel that they had a different life in the past, or they see some premonition of something coming. It's because the space-time continuum is folded on itself and you got a wormhole connected. So we have no idea what's going on. We're just getting a little taste of it. It's exciting, it really is. But I don't believe it's left-right brain issue. I think it's interstitial.
Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you.
Bernard, Bernard is our president. You're next.
Thank you. So, Bob, thank you very much. I was very interested in your talk. My ears particularly pricked up, though, towards the end when you started talking about the singularities, because I should say I am a cosmologist, so this is in my professional domain of interest. Now, I have to say, most cosmologists would not be particularly swayed by that argument because, well, most cosmologists aren't very interested in mystical and near-death experiences. And they would say, well, a singularity is just saying there's a mystery, no one knows what happens, so it's easy to connect one mystery, what happens at the Big Bang, with another mystery, what happens when you have a near-death experience. But actually, I don't take that view. And I very much side in this matter, and I might just explain why. And this is because it seems to me that you need a sort of broader view of physics, which goes beyond normal space and time to accommodate not only the physical world, but the mental and spiritual world. And as people who've heard me spout on about this many times before will know, my own favored model is the sort of hyperspatial model where you have higher dimensions. And you need that higher dimensional realm to describe near-death experiences and various types of transpersonal experiences. At least that's the hypothesis. But the point is, within this picture, if you ask where does the universe come from at the Big Bang, it does in some sense emerge from mind, because those higher dimensions come in at that, if you like, at the Big Bang. And I should stress, this is not the mainstream cosmological view, but it's just my particular view. And so the idea that the higher realm of reality, which you're encountering at the beginning of the universe, is related to the higher dimensional realm encountered in mystical and near-death experiences, to me makes a lot of sense. And I have to say that I side with Hesse rather than Hawking in this, even though I'm a great admirer of Hawking, obviously. So, well, I guess that's a word of encouragement, but I might be the only cosmologist who would agree with you, but I do agree with you. And I thank you for your talk, but I particularly like that remark you made towards the end.
Thank you, Bernard. I don't know whether you want to say anything about that or just take that as a comment, Bob.
I never question any compliments like that.
Right. Okay.
I agree.
Excellent. And incidentally, Stephen Hawking was Bernard's PhD supervisor.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Well, I'm sorry I had to refer to him.
No, that's fine. So Steve wouldn't be pleased to hear me saying I sided with Hesse rather than Hawking, but well, Stephen probably didn't hear the remark.
Well, did you?
Right. Well, that raises another issue. Angus, you're on next.
Thanks very much, and thanks for a very interesting talk, Bob. As a neurologist, I just want to add a note of caution about some of the interpretation of EEGs and MRIs and heart rate variabilities. But the first thing I'd say is I think it's it's very interesting, isn't it, that there are these very similar phenomenological properties between, or semiological properties, between NDEs, between mystic experiences, and between psychedelic experiences. There are these various things that you can draw, and I think it is really important to do studies where you start to try and look at the differences, which is indeed the sort of main purpose of your study, to try and pull out what are the differences between these experiences. So that's the good. Now for the bad. So I think the first thing I'd say is it's not really at all surprising that your peaceful NDE experiences, are going to have different EEG and fMRI appearances to your anxious ones when you recall them. And I don't think it's any surprise that peaceful recall of peaceful transcendent experiences are going to be more similar to peaceful NDEs. It seems reasonably obvious to me, but to claim statistically significant differences when you've got n equals 5 in each group, I think is pushing the science a little bit too hard. And I think you need much larger numbers for a study like this. I think you probably need a tighter protocol as well. And I'm sure Andrew Newberg would agree with that. The other thing I would say is that there were no controls, as in controls who hadn't had any of these transcendent experiences. Because when you get controls to sort of remember peaceful times in their lives, they may have very similar EEG and fMRI and heart rate variability features. So I'm not sure we can read too much into the EEGs, although it was nice to see a few EEGs, a little bit of science. So what I suppose I'm saying is, it's a comment really rather than a question, is that we can certainly draw some conclusions about the differences in phenomenology, but I don't think we can draw any conclusions about differences in the EEG, the heart rate variabilities, or the fMRI. So that was just my comment.
Thank you very much, Angus. Bob.
I agree with you completely, because we didn't have enough subjects. Okay, number one. And maybe the word significant, I agree with you. That's probably too powerful of a word, but there's certainly, I think, enough encouragement to go deeper with more people. I think that's really the message. It's not that we have something that's hard and fast here. And as far as the control comment, that has been raised by others. One control issue was, well, you're not having the person think about something like peeling a banana, okay? They were just resting state. And we should have had them thinking about something innocuous. So that's a legitimate complaint. And so that was part of the limitations. What you're describing were in those limitations. And like any arrogant scientist, I put those very small, but actually those are big limitations.
Yeah, thank you very much. By the way, I'm sure people are aware there's some fascinating exchanges going on in the chat, but I'd like to keep taking live questions, and then if we run out of hands, which we don't seem to be doing at the moment, then we'll go to some of the written questions as well. So Sigmar, you're next, and I should say that Sigmar is up on our program in about a month. Sigmar, how lovely to see you.
Yes, right. We'll talk about similar topic, even though with a different aspect. I came in a couple of minutes late, so I'm not sure whether Robert had its own near-death experience, but I became aware in that comparison of that research. I have a near-death, I had a near-death experience, and I also have mystical experiences. And what Angus just mentioned, I also had psychedelic experience. And they all three have a very different field experience. So, and the questionnaires that coming, they are true about timelessness, affective peace, transcendent oneness, but nevertheless, I felt never addressed when the topic of NDE was coming in here. And I remember Congress we had with Erwin Laszlo, where I also presented with Pim van Lommel and Raymond Moody and so on. And Raymond talked to me that he was trying to invent a nonsense language for after near-death experiences, so that because as soon we come to the rational mind, we fade out of that experience. All these have been difficult to differentiate, but I know that mystical experience and psychedelic experience are more in my present adult state of consciousness that I can formulate, whereas a near-death experience, maybe because I had it as a child, it's very different to bring that into intellectual parameter. I mean, I did some research in infrared analysis and biophotonics, and it's the same what Angus said. We always have to be wary about what the interpretation is and how we try to prove our own experiences. And at the same time, of course, as Robert says, find similarities, but not equivalence.
Yeah.
So
Thank you very much.
Yeah, so that's the main thing. They're different fields of experiences.
Bob?
Well, I think you got a good point, and I think that might be an indication, or maybe there should be research done on what I had observed in those three people that I just taught suddenly to. Mm-hmm. And then they had a SCE in remembrance of their NDE. And I would love to do that study, because that would address, I think it would address your issue.
Yeah.
And I think it'd be a fascinating study. because it didn't happen just by accident. I mean, there was clearly, they relived it and they described it, what they went through. And I was amazed.
Thank you.
But yeah.
Matt, you're next.
Oh yeah.
By the way, one other thing I wanted to mention real quick. To answer your question, yeah, I did not have a near-death experience myself, but I did have a mystical experience, an SCE.
Yeah.
And so I think, like a lot of us here, I would bet that there's a much higher percentage of people that have had these kinds of experiences than in the general public. That's why you're all here. That's why we're here. Okay.
Yeah.
So that creates the incentive. I know it was real. You know?
Maybe I can make a short comment to that. What was also missing in the whole interpretation, that word love didn't come up. So I will attend to that in my lecture then in a month. And
Matt, I'm sorry I cut you off.
Oh, that's okay. Very interesting talk. I think this came up in the chat room. It's really that looking at the obviously we're looking at the biology of memory recall here, and something that I've been wondering a little bit is that if we assume that experiences of these states really do touch a transcendent realm, there's a couple of issues that crop up for me. The first is really how does that translate into experiences that can be processed by the brain? And the second question that follows from that is how literally should we take some aspects of these experiences, particularly the imagery? I don't know whether you have any thoughts on that sort of issue.
Well, I think I think you're right. We can't take them literally, and because I sensed a similarity, and I also saw it happen when I was teaching this, and they remember their near-death experience. That's what drove it. How much similarity there is, I was looking for it from a scientific standpoint. Okay, from a spiritual standpoint, I was not going to try to grab it in my own personal life. Okay, but I can tell you in my own mystical experience, what I remember vividly is the memory of the experience slipping away. I wasn't comprehending the totality of what had happened. That memory was slipping away, not just the experience. So the experience and the memory were linked somehow, very strangely. And I went into a real physical soreness. I think my brain was shorting out and all the muscles were going to spasm, and I didn't know it. I was crappy. And when I got all done, I felt like I played 3 football games. I mean, you know, it's unbelievable. It's painful. So there's a lot going on, and we don't know. And so I know that we're touching just the edges here. And I think a good scientist looks for similarities, but also acknowledges differences, like we saw in the Grayson scale change. That was strange.
Yes, thank you. Marianne, we'll go to you next because you appeared and disappeared. So your question or observation. You need to unmute. You need to unmute.
Yes, so I'm a little bit humble, perhaps. I don't know if my question makes much sense, but you were talking about possible future consequences, or you know what it could lead to. And I'm into education, and do I get it right that or could you agree with me, or could you answer the question that one could use part of your research or the outcome, that one can induce perhaps even states of peacefulness or, you know, higher cognition consciously, or even in education, in, you know, that you maybe offer it in schools as a topic, as a new topic in schools where there's spirituality in schools, and based on all these neurological correlations, because that's what people nowadays actually accept more than anything of the, you know, the woo-woo spiritual blah blah. But could you see a lead into that from your, you know, that you can offer this more as an experience one can induce and to the benefit of.
Yeah, I think I understand the question. Here's where my science brain and my theological brain part. Okay, the word induce implies we have control over this, and in my theological brain, and actually a practical way, that's the very thing that's going to keep you from having the experience. Is trying to grab it. You cannot induce it. Okay. Now you can set up parameters, and you can set up a situation where you make yourself more open to the experience coming. If it comes, you can't hold on to it. That gets back to the earlier question. This is the cross and the threes of Adam. These are solid teachings through religion, okay? And it's not just Christianity. And as far as in that silence, there's no dogma. So you can. I teach this interfaith. I've taught it,
exactly. But that's the educational setting also. Yeah.
I've taught it to the Muslims in Konya, Turkey, in the city where Sufism is. I've taught it all around the world in different religious faiths. And you have to describe it a little bit better. I won't say the indwelling spirit, but all of the Abrahamic faiths believe in an indwelling God. So it can be presented that way. Answering your question about children, it's being taught to children in grade schools in Australia.
Really?
Yeah.
Yes, and the Christian meditation movement also has meditation going on in schools. So there are a number of programs going on. I've experienced this myself in a place in North London. We need to keep going because we've still got 4 hands up. Thank you very much, Marianne. Barbara, you're next.
Hello. I actually I would like to drag Piet van Lommel into discussion, and I have a reason to do so because in 2007 I had near-death experience, and it was his book, which I read in Dutch. I'm not sure whether it was translated into English, which helped me a lot. And I realized I will pay very dearly for it, because it changed my life. It did change. I'm not going too much into detail. So I would like Pete to tell us about his research and what he found, because I think you must have looked at 10,000 patients, something like that. Over to you.
Also, Barbara, do think coming along tomorrow night, because that's the sort of topic that we are, sorry, on Friday night to the members.
I can't Friday night because I do meditation for a college. I can only come after 7.
Well, no, that's after 7 is perfect.
Okay.
Yeah.
And one more short comment. I also had Zen experiences, and not all of them were accepted by my teachers as real one. The ultimate experience is such one that you can't talk about it, not that you don't want to, but you simply can't. And some that people can talk, we consider makyo or hallucinations. And I think something which people experience near-death experience, like seeing angels or grandparents, can be considered at the same level. But sorry, I finished and I come tomorrow. Okay.
Maybe you'd like to make a brief observation on that. And Peter Fenix actually up next, and so we can hear from him directly.
No, I don't have any comment.
Peter. You need to unmute yourself. You're on.
Yeah, got it. Yeah, got it. Bob, thank you so much for that. And I am very supportive of a lot of the comments that have made, but also very supportive of your work, because it has to begin somewhere. And as you said, pointed out yourself, the sample size is very small. You talked about near-death experiences, but they aren't holistic things. What I'd like to know is what sort of near-death experiences they were. They're quite you can have near-death experiences from a fear-death experience. Is obviously something which is quite different. You can have a transcendent experiences which goes into the same phenomena as near-death experiences, and they are quite different. And one of the reasons why we did all our work on cardiac arrests, because that was the only one where we felt that we knew, in fact, what the brain states were at the time of the experience. And so there was some equivalence in the others who don't. So that's my first point, my first set of points. But I want to now go on to the much more positive side. And I think this is very exciting, because we're coming now down to what death actually is and the fine-grained nature of death. Because what has become apparent is that, in fact, death is not a contraction and a writing out, it is an expansion of consciousness. And it looks as if many near-death people, many dying people become non-dual. In other words, their egoic structures are destroyed by the dying process and they become non-dual. And then they have very similar mystical experiences which you were describing. And I think that to be able to get these two forms of experience together is very good. Can we say more than that? Yes, I think we can, because you talked about fear-death experiences. You talked about negative near-death experiences, and you talked about the the leaving of this nice heavenly realm and coming back into life again as being difficult. In fact, in the experiences we've had where people have gone into this alternate reality, which is love and light, and then come back again, they don't actually mind it. You wouldn't expect to get a strong negative memory for this. So in some ways, the leaving of the love and the light isn't quite as traumatic, but it may be because the dying people know they're going there anyway. And indeed, there seems to be a lot of guidance at that time, with spiritual beings talking to them and dead relatives talking to them and saying that they'll be there to carry them through it. So congratulations on a very nice early study. A lot of flaws in it, but some very nice things coming out of it. So have I got a question? Yes. Question is, what were your near-death experiences? Were they all the same? Were they different? That's a good question.
Yeah, thank you, Peter. Bob?
There are two ways of looking at their experience. One was the Grayson scale to show that they had the same attributes, and so they shared that. In one case, that subject changed his mind and came full circle and changed his mind on the Grayson scale he took in the beginning. So the only way we can figure this, and there is no way of knowing, but it's explainable by this transition through a door and you're getting on a better side. Who knows? Who knows? Then as far as the types of deaths they went through, that on that table, most of them were cardiac arrests, but the table gave other reasons why they were dying. So the medical record of them and what they died of is there, but it doesn't help us with what the actual transition was. We don't know. The only reason that the only conclusion I can draw from it at this stage is that because there is some commonality with pleasant experiences, why not use this to teach not just students in school, but in palliative care? To me, that's where the first application should be. Teach them century prayer, teach them that's not just century prayer, but if you could teach them Kabbalah, you can teach them Sufism, but they all are doing the same thing because it's all in that silence. There's no dogma. So it's pretty easy to pull off. It really can do it. I don't know if I answered the question, but
in fact, this very point came up in our breakout room with Peter. The idea that teaching centering prayer and of spiritual practices that can help people in hospices. Right, we're now on to Una, or is it Ivan?
Yes, thank you, David. Rob, I wanted to ask you whether you have delved into thanatology, which is the study and practice of assisting people who are dying into some sort of transcendent state, accompanied by music, almost analogous to light, but in sound, and where musical instruments, especially the harp, seem to play a particular interesting part. And I wonder if you have had any experience of this or been in contact with people who are doing this during this process of death or dying.
No, I haven't. The answer is simple. The answer is no, I haven't. But I'm not surprised, because the vestibule for contemplative prayer, which in the Christian tradition dates back to the 4th century, was with chant. You know, the melodic, simple one note, and it puts you in a resting state. And the beat of the music, about 80 beats per minute, is about the same as the beat of the heart in a resting state. So it shouldn't be a surprise that music can synchronize us into a settled state in preparation as a vestibule to the prayer. So that's been historically known in religion. But so I'm not surprised at what you say, but I'm not familiar with the research.
Yes, thank you, Bob. In fact, I just put a couple of things into the chat with Therese Schroeder-Schieker and her chaliceurepose.org. This is exactly what you're talking about. It's accompanying the dying with music. And her tradition goes back to Cluny and monks using these tones and music to help their brothers leave the body. And there were certain rhythms and tones that helped this. That's what they found kind of empirically. So you can all look that one up, and you can also listen to Therese on YouTube in concert, because she's a concert harpist as well as accompanying the dying. Thank you very much, Ivan. And
I'm sorry, I use a Tibetan singing bowl, and I've clocked it at 80 beats per minute. So it's a nice, easy way of going in. That's why we use a bowl. Go ahead. Sorry.
Okay, thank you very much indeed. Sylvia.
Yeah, I'm not brilliantly scientific, although I do struggle to read it and understand it because I find it fascinating. But my experience is much more to do with the transcendent experience. I've had a few kind of fleeting ones that you've talked about, the ones that you can't grab hold of. Then I had one that lasted 4.5 months without any let up at all. I was completely in what I describe as the abyss for 4.5 months. I was fully conscious, fully functioning, but there was just no sense of ego, no sense of self, no sense of anything other than a complete connectedness. And if I switched my mind off from the outside world, I just felt like I was floating in this huge lagoon of molecules of consciousness. And it was infinite. There was no, and it was perfectly comfortable. It was perfect temperature. It was golden light everywhere, or a sense of golden light everywhere. And it was an astonishing thing. And it lasted for about 4.5 months. It was, and then something happened and broke it through. But ever since, this is years ago now, but ever since then, it just comes back on me. It's just, I suddenly find I'm walking up the street and suddenly I'm flipped right out of my body and I don't have any connection to anything and nothing matters. I mean, it has dramatically transformed my life because I've lost a lot of sense of self or ego and a lot of connection to the material world and even to people, although I'm still very much love the people I'm close to, my family and stuff. I don't have any sense of attachment to them. It's, I mean, I'm using Buddhist terms here because that was the nearest I got to trying to explain what it felt like. But I just wondered if you, Robert, did you have anyone who'd had prolonged experiences like mine on the course, or was it just these short transcendent ones? Because also I have it comes on me. I can call it back through meditation, but it actually just happens to me randomly. It's peculiar.
Now, is it pleasurable?
Yeah, I love it.
Yeah, okay. It's not unusual to have these spontaneous SCEs. The only reason I was talking about century prayer is it gives us a vehicle to try to know where these people are. Finding people like you is much more difficult. So getting a subject for research like you is much more difficult. I know an individual that has this come on a couple times, 3 times a week. And so I've made arrangements when this COVID thing's over is to get him, to put him in part of a study. That's what I want to do. And so I would like to get people like him and like you who have these things spontaneously and study them and compare them to a base case of somebody that doesn't have these. Because I believe that it's the same type of experience as a mystical experience that comes on as a result of prayer or meditation, but it's spontaneous. And why they have it, I have no idea. I look at it as gift as a religious person, but I also look at it as a scientist. I believe God is inside of that. I can understand God more by studying the science of it. I look for God everywhere, you know.
Yeah. And I think people on the call, if you're not familiar with the work of Jeffrey Martin, I think you'll find this very interesting. Peter put me onto this, and you'll see there's a review of his book in the current issue, and he describes various what he calls locations beyond on a spectrum of consciousness, and where you can move between them, but you have a different sense of ego, different sense of feelings depending on where you are. I'm going to take this last question, which is a detailed one from the chat here from Paul. It seems to me that the big challenge for this kind of study is the difference between a deep mystical experience and memories of that experience, which are likely to be a poor reflection of the experience itself. Mystical experiences are of a different order, barely captured by memories, which you said yourself, in fact. You acknowledge this potential problem, but how to get round it? I wonder how your results compare with the psychedelic brain scanning research, which utilizes the experiences themselves. How about that, Bob?
Now, psychedelic, you mean drugs? Is that what you're talking about?
Yes, no, but I think the point, the more important point is the difference between the experience and the memory of it.
Oh, yeah. Well, let me tell you how this research was born. Suddenly, I made the connection. So I go to Calixto Machado, and I said, you've got people that told you about near-death experiences? He says, yeah. I said, and you've got brain scans with one of those people? And he said, well, I don't know that those scans were at the moment they were having their near-death experience. I said to him, well, it doesn't matter. Look for the patterns. Maybe there's a pattern there. Then he launched into this memory issue. And I honestly, not being a neuroscientist, didn't believe him. But he kept insisting, yeah, it's not going to duplicate it, but it's pretty darn close. It's the basis of PTSD. Suddenly the brain goes back in time and has that experience again. And in the case of PTSD, I taught it to 10 people. One guy, I'm on to 3 months later, out the breakout room, we talked about it. I said, how's it going? He said, well, not too good. I said, what happened? He said, well, during the prayer, I realized what really happened to me in Vietnam. I said, well, what did you do? He said, I ever so gently let it go and return to God. That's the unloading of the unconscious. I told that to the head of the psychiatric department at Baylor. He's now at the Menninger Clinic here in Houston. We got the largest medical center in the world here. His eyes popped out. He said, we don't know how to treat PTSD. We've got floors of patients at the VA hospital. So there's another application. And I had put a research program together for a guy at the VA, but he got shipped off. And so I've got the project ready, but I don't have the access. I'm sorry if I blow the end.
No, well, thank you very much, Bob. Well, I can tell from, we have almost a record number of questions this evening. Some evenings we don't have many questions at all. And so your talk has stimulated a lot of thought. And what I've been struck by as well is the quality of what's been going on in the chat, which you won't have been able to to cover yourself. But we will send you that,
Okay.
so that you will see the sort of things that people were talking about, and also giving references to one or two papers, and everybody commenting on each other. So thank you very much, everybody, for entering into the spirit of this, and the process of exchange between us who are on the call, not just with Bob. And so, as I say, I'd like to thank you very much, Bob. Still the middle of the day for you there, for spending this time with us and for your comprehensive answers to questions. And I think everybody will be very interested to see how this research develops, because as you said yourself, it's in an early stage. It gives a few pointers, and there's an awful lot more that could be developed out of it. And those of you who would like to be in direct touch with Bob, we'll be sending out the PowerPoint and the recording in 2 or 3 days. So you'll get a chance to have a look at that. So it remains for me just to say that our next event on Friday is with Richard Layard, on something rather different, but we have a great variety in our programs, which is happiness. Can we create a happier society?
Yeah,
Bob, yes.
One last thing. On the slides, there's a email address for Calixto Machado. He's a good friend of mine. He's a wonderful person. He's a neuroscientist, and you can email him, and there's good communication with Cuba. It's a bit more difficult with this kind of a thing in their bandwidth down there, but he's wonderful, and he's open to you sending him emails.
Well, we'll maybe get him to join you, or get him to do a session at some point.
Yeah, he might be after the COVID. Right?
Yeah, thanks so much, Bob, and thank you very much, Andrew, for hosting us this evening, and to everybody for their questions and comments. And we'll do our usual practice where we unmute everybody so that we can say goodbye and look forward to seeing each other very soon. So goodbye from me, and thank you so much for coming. And thank you very much again.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you.
Bedankt. Dankjewel. Bye bye. Dag.
Ciao, ciao.
Leuk. Mooi. Ja.